to the Acid Trash Jamboree, the home of strange and psychedelic music and films. Now, in this episode, I'll be delving into the output of the group Dope, sometimes known as Dope 13, a project centred around Julian Cope, which also features members of other Cope-led acts like Black Sheep, as well as contributors to his solo albums. Dope have been officially active since 2015, with the first clutch of releases seeing the light of day in 2017, though as we'll get onto, work apparently began on some of the pieces a few years prior to this. Now, as well as describing themselves as the festival band from hell that plays outside the gates of Worthy Farm, in the words of Cope, Dope set out as a dark, groove-based thing, monotonous mainly and highly drug-informed, which is a brief they've sometimes deviated from, but again, this is something I'll be touching on later. I don't have everything they've done, but the 6 releases I'll be covering here definitely give a good idea of their sound, so without further ado, let's get stuck into some Dope. Okay, so Dope feat. Julian Cope appears to have been their first full-length album, initially released on cassette only in 2017, then reissued on vinyl the next year. The D.D. Ramone story, the first of 2 side-long epics here, starts with a seemingly deliberately lo-fi, under-recorded song fragment, which is melodically very similar to Pink Floyd's Brain Damage, and seesaws between 2 woozy organ chords over a persistent pulsing beat, before the piece opens out into a lovely pastoral zone, with falsetto vocals floating over delicate acoustic guitar loops, pitched somewhere between Sergius Golovin's Lord Krishna von Goloka and the first Kingsbury Manx album. This is followed by a wigged-out, one-chord krautrock jamathon, which can't decide if it wants to tip its hat the most to Neu 75, the self-titled La Dusseldorf effort, first couple of Cosmic Jokers records, or Ashrar Temple's classic jam Amboss, so instead it greedily gobbles up the lot and barfs them out as a wild, technicolor splurge, with motoric drums pushed way up front over hairy guitar god noodling. By the end, Dope have thrown any notion of a key signature out of the window, surging ahead into a reverbed-out space abyss, Acid Mother's Temple style. Over on side B, we find Absalom and Ahitophel, which again starts off as a song of sorts before swimming off into jammier waters. Unlike the multi-sectioned A-side, this one seems quite content to stay put. Its shuffly rhythm and minimalist bass line, sounding a bit like Metal Box era Public Image Limited, reimagining Syd Barrett's Gigolo Ant down in German Oak's air raid shelter to sneakily borrow a Copeism there. So yeah, nowhere near as sonically varied as the previous piece, but certainly more in line with Cope's initial promise of groovy monotony. Now, 3 Dope full lengths emerged in 2018. I'm not sure what order they came out in originally, but the Discogs release date for Dope on Drugs is given as February, so I'll talk about that one next. As one reviewer before me so rightly observed, opener Foden is a slightly ramshackle combination of rickety 60s garage rock stylings and motoric krautrock, again of the Neu and La Dusseldorf variety, though unfortunately at a mere 5 minutes the piece doesn't really get a chance to spread its wings, as it were. The 19-minute Leave Yourself Behind is much more substantial, with a florid, proggy intro throwing us a bit of a sonic curveball, sounding like it could have been filched directly from some 1970s Euro melodrama movie, before getting into the meat of the matter, a spongy, bouncy, mantric dual vocal thumper, which starts off like Paradise Fart's Duel era Amon Duel, attempting a remake of Can's You Do Right, whilst John Cale sits in on drone piano and Cotton Casino goes mental on synths. It builds up a nice head of steam with Cope and Holy McGrail going nuts at the mic, though towards the end the piece loses sight of its modal monotony and gets a bit too caught up in fussy, hackneyed, endless climax chord progressions and guitar harmony overdubs, which detracts somewhat from the spontaneous freak-out vibe of the main jamming section. The third and final piece, The Binding of Loki, sees Dope teaming up with the double bass duo of William James Wayne Esquire and Gareth Turner, aka F Authority. They form a stellar rhythm section with whichever fella is on bongo duties here, whilst endless streams of soft synthesizer atonality ooze all over their horizontally relaxed hippie jazz groove. Very nice, in a Sylvester Anfang 2, go back in time to record a Jess Franco soundtrack with early Popol Vuh kind of a way. Following an interlude of freeform space noodling, a different groove fades in, the bass line now very much in the tradition, shall we say, of The Kinks' You Really Got Me, Soft Machine's We Did It Again, and Lucifer's Banshee, this time overlaid with an uncanny approximation of the kooky organ devilry from Miles Davis's avant-funk masterwork Rated X. Village Idiot Dope is next, and it's very much a kind of companion piece to Dope on Drugs. Track 1, Frenzy of the Earth, hinges around a sibilant When the Levee Breaks style breakbeat, and overall is a similar spongy affair to Leave Yourself Behind. Again bringing to mind Can's You Do Right, but mixed up with 60s wig-out organ washes and numbskull chromatic guitar figures, straight out of Status Quo's Pictures of Matchstick Men, or the aforementioned Lucifer's Big Gun LP. Again though, Dope can't help breaking out of their eternal jam trance-out mode, and we get another I Am the Walrus style climactic finish, which thankfully fades out before it has a chance to do too much damage. The near 20-minute epic, It's Been Good For You, is much starker and simpler, featuring more of that electric-era Miles, atonal drone organ weirdness, hard pan to the right channel, and a slow, elasticated drum and bass groove in the left. As the piece bobs along, Dope add in field recordings of birdsong, as well as spots of very subtle and quiet wah guitar and synth embellishment, though overall this one sticks very closely to the groove-based, drug-informed Monotony brief and is not too dissimilar to some of Sunburned Hand of the Man's funkier excursions as a result. The closing You Took Me By Surprise borrows a title from Bristol Stoners The Heads and overall is much more animated, with Ginger Baker-esque tom rumblings underpinning a persistent, bubbling synth drone and another dumbass simple bass line for 11 wah-tastic minutes, before breaking out into rich, poppy Technicolor for its coda, which just about stays on the right side of cheesiness, thanks to all the unhinged guitar torture being committed somewhere off in the background. On to 7 disquieting dirges, performed by sub-bass Madmen and Throwback FX Contrarians, the first of 2 full collaborations with the aforementioned experimental double bass abuser F Authority. And yeah, just going back to Public Image Limited and Metal Boxes for a second, as you can see, this very limited CD comes packaged in a rather snazzy tin case. Now, when I first heard about Dope, I had a certain sound in mind that I was hoping they'd at least come close to. And yeah, as soon as opener Cornish Funeral Paths started up with its mournful bass sawing and third ear band style pitter-pattering hand percussion, I remember thinking this is exactly the sort of miserable, trudging pagan doomscape that I've been praying for all along. Indeed, the promo blurb for this album mentions Wolfmangler of all projects, whose sound Cope once memorably described as being like compost with a grudge, and yeah, this opening piece definitely touches on their unique sound. There probably aren't many of us left out there now, but I too love Wolfmangler, not to mention Smolkin's other projects like Dead Raven Choir and Garlic Yarg, and really need to dedicate a video to that stuff someday. Anyway, following a brief, palate-cleansing fragment of solo bass music, the first of 3 on this album, Cope & Co. throw us another thoroughly head-scratching curveball in the form of a fiery flying roll, a tense and rather obtuse piece, dominated by droning organ and hammering piano figures, which would have been right at home on a Lucio Fulci score back in the early 80s. By the time of the Anglo-Saxon work ethic, the first of 2 double-digit epics here, It's back to the doomic bass trudgery, with Turner looping his minimalist riffage as sickly synths swirl ominously overhead like apocalyptic air raid sirens. The Ranters is easily the album's highlight, condensing most of what's gone before on 7 disquieting dirges into one action-packed and frankly terrifying 16-minute sonic collage, adding in some evocative heathen chanting along the way, with Cope almost sounding like he's channeling Marcus Wolf at times. So yeah, quite an intense listen overall. In truth, it's definitely the least groove-based dope album so far, with even the pagan procession-styled Wolf Mangler influences soon going by the wayside as the pieces get more abstracted and electronically inclined. But this is still good stuff. If you also appreciate the early albums by Sun or Holy McGrail's main gig Slow Mo, then you'll definitely get something out of this too. That said, strangely enough, McGrail doesn't actually seem to appear on this album. 2019's Black Math is the second of the full-length collaborations with F Authority, and yeah, this very much carries on with the heathen Dark Ages feel of 7 disquieting dirges. If anything, this one goes even further into the thorny, blackened heart of the ancient woods in search of its gnarled musical truffles. Opener 666 is Dope's Wolf Manglerious creation thus far, a 10-minute folk horrorscape with guttural Germanic chanting, sloppy drum thwacking, and even sloppier hunting horn parping over a bowel-shakingly sonorous bowed bass riff. The band sounding like a mead-sozzled troop of orcs marching back to Mordor after a long day of hobbit slaughtering. The next 3 pieces segue into one another. 13, Part 1, picks up the pace considerably, mostly consisting of ritualistic drumming and frantic and obsessive string sawing, all topped off with an animalistic yell or two, before 50-40 offers a bit of respite for a couple of minutes, with a sinister, coil-esque dark jazz theme circling behind Christopher Holman's rather severe-sounding narration concerning ostracism in ye olde times. 51-69 then brings the noise with a chaotic melange of pulsing bass chug, sheets of freeform space squealing, and curious bent note bluesiness, presumably from Turner's double bass partner in crime, William James Wayne Esquire. Towards the end of this 8-minute monster, things calm down a touch with Cope's delicate glockenspiel refrain emerging bruised but defiant from the fray. After this, 13 Part 2 closes things out with some grotesque, lurching ambience, sounding not unlike the Taj Mahal Travellers performing on the banks of some enormous fetid swamp, as the menacing, propulsive rhythms from Part 1 eventually make a reappearance, albeit in a slightly more muted fashion than earlier, grumbling away incessantly as any cultic death dirge worth its salt ought to. So yeah, Black Math is another one that doesn't so much groove as it does trudge and swirl, though speaking as a huge fan of all forms of dark, psychedelic and experimental folk music, this album is massively appealing to me nonetheless. 2020's Semi-Legal on the Edge of Culture is the last Dope release to date, though apparently the material presented here is their earliest of all, with the opener Nothinglessness apparently being started circa 2010. This is another one that unabashedly wears its influences on its sleeve, oozing out of the speakers like some dream team jam between mid-70s Miles, Fela Kuti, James Brown and just post-Darmo era Can. As we've come to expect from the other Dope efforts discussed here, some of the overdubbed embellishments take away a little from the illusion that this was all improvised on the fly. Otherwise, this is an excellent 20-minute stretch of steaming avant swamp funk. The unambiguously titled Drugs follows and is a lot moodier in tone, opening with Cope reading a John Sinclair monologue about his substance of choice over shuffling drum machine rhythms, before dark, lo-fi synth bass farts enter the picture, followed by skanking guitar and industrialised swirls of freeform electronics. At around the 14-minute mark, a brooding electric guitar line almost threatens to take the track into spaghetti western territory before it's abstracted into oblivion by some psychedelic FX tomfoolery. I haven't heard it, but there's also a much shorter, so-called 7-inch mix of this piece, which came out on the maxi 12-inch vinyl EP in 2017. And speaking of mixes, after a lengthy intro of bongos, Klaus Schulze-style synth drones and out-of-tune bass jamming, piece 3, Too Much Religion, eventually reveals itself to be an exploratory dub version of a 1976 tune by one Jerry Hitler, aka Jerry Harris. At times, we hear the members of Dope playing along with this low-key roots reggae obscurity. At others, they're quite content to just let the record play on and on. Yeah, weirdly, this dub remix of another artist's track seems to fit in better with Dope's overall aesthetic than a lot of the other stylistic curveballs that they've tossed us thus far. The last track, I Need Dope, is the shortest one here, clocking in at a mere 11.5 minutes and consisting of short bursts of atonal guitar noise and endlessly reverbed ghost vocals over more of that caveman bongo pattering. Very nice. Perhaps this is the kind of thing we'd have ended up with if Genesis P. Orridge had continued his association with the Third Ear Band and invited them down to a few throbbing gristle rehearsals. Anyway, despite the questionable choice of artwork on this album, track to track, I'd say this one is perhaps the most consistent of the full lengths and certainly the one with the least sonic deviations. Yeah, excellent stuff. So, that's what I have so far by Dope. Unfortunately, as with most recent Cope-related releases, demand outstripped the supply. Consequently, much of their catalogue is long sold out and scarce, and when things do show up, they've started to change hands for rather large sums of money. The CD version of Gorilla Grow, for example, is particularly hard to score, whilst the vinyl-only, limited to 200 copies Odin on Acid has already started to sell for over £100. As for whether the music's worth tracking down for non-Cope completists, well, that depends on how much long-form psychedelic jam music you need in your life. Certainly, if you like his long-running series of Right albums, then there's a lot to offer here, though, as I've mentioned many times during the course of this video, sometimes Dope lose sight of the original groovy Monotony brief, factoring in wildcard influences which don't always work or even make any sense. As with Cope's music writing, Dope's sound is laden with nods to all sorts of freaky rock, funk, jazz and electronic stuff from back in the day, so if this kind of explicitly referential record collection type music irks you at all, then you'll probably be best off sticking with your 70s originals. Otherwise, yeah, there's lots to absorb here, so dig in if you can. Okay, so that's it for another video. I hope this partial overview of Dope's discography has been somewhat entertaining. Feel free to take a look around the channel for even more chatter about esoteric and underground music, and if you like what you see, please hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks as ever for watching, and I'll see you next time on the Acid Trash Jamboree.